Simón Trinidad. During the peace negotiations in Havana, the largest guerrilla army in Colombia sat down across from government envoys with an empty chair beside their delegation. In that chair, they had placed a life-size cardboard cutout of a man. He was their former lead negotiator, and they wanted him returned so badly that they were willing to bend an entire nation's peace process around his name. But the man in that cutout was already sealed inside the most secure prison in the United States, and there was nothing an army could do to bring him back. Before he became Simón Trinidad, he was Juvenal Ovidio Ricardo Palmera Pineda, born in 1950 in Valledupar, in Colombia's Cesar department, into a comfortable land-owning family tied to the Liberal Party. He trained as an economist. He managed a bank. By the standards of the men he would one day command, he was an aristocrat, and that made his decision to abandon all of it and join the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the group known as the FARC, all the more difficult for outsiders to understand. He rose quickly, became a commander associated with the Caribbean bloc, and by the late 1990s, he had become the public face of the guerrillas at the failed peace talks in San Vicente del Caguán. The event that pulled the United States into his life happened on the 13th of February, 2003. A surveillance plane operated by American defense contractors went down deep inside territory the FARC controlled. 3 of the men aboard, Mark Gonsalves, Thomas Howes, and Keith Stansel, all working for Northrop Grumman, survived the crash and were taken into the jungle. They would be held there for 5 years. Their captivity became one of the most closely watched hostage situations in the hemisphere, and it did not end until the 2nd of July, 2008, when the Colombian military recovered them through a bloodless deception known as Operation Jaque. In Colombia itself, Trinidad faced more than 100 separate charges, spanning rebellion, kidnapping, and according to prosecutors, a role in the death of former culture minister Consuelo Araujo, though the precise extent of his responsibility for that has long been disputed. He was arrested in early 2004 in Quito, Ecuador, deported to Colombia, and finally, on the last day of that year, extradited to the United States. He became the first member of the FARC ever handed over to American courts, and that distinction mattered. He was not a foot soldier. He was a commander who had once sat across from a president's negotiators, and now he was being processed into a foreign prison system built to make men disappear. His extradition was both a landmark and a lightning rod. To Washington, it was a signal that not even a guerrilla commander who had once negotiated with a sitting president was beyond the reach of American courts. To many Colombians, it was a national wound, the handing of a homegrown insurgent leader to a foreign government, and for years afterward, the FARC would treat his return as a demand that could not be dropped, a name that had to be spoken in any room where peace was discussed. What does a government do with a prisoner an entire insurgency wants back? The United States tried him across 4 separate proceedings. The first attempt to convict him of the hostage-taking ended in a mistrial. A retrial found him guilty on a single count: conspiracy to hold the 3 Americans hostage. Separate drug trafficking charges collapsed into hung juries and were quietly dropped in 2008. On the 28th of January that year, a federal court in the District of Columbia sentenced him to 60 years in prison, 20 years for each of the 3 contractors. His conviction was later upheld on appeal. Then, he disappeared into the deepest hold the federal system has, spending roughly 12 years under special administrative measures, the restrictions reserved for inmates the government believes can still direct violence or coordinate operations from inside a cell. That was the whole reason he was buried so deep. The measures existed to sever him from FARC networks, and they worked so completely that when the guerrillas finally sat at the negotiating table in Havana, The most they could manage was to set out a cardboard likeness of him. As of early 2026, Trinidad remains held at the federal Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, with a projected release date in the year 2055. The story around him has kept moving, even if his sentence has not. In April of 2025, Colombia's Special Jurisdiction for Peace granted him amnesty for the crime of rebellion, and in late 2024, Colombia's embassy formally asked the United States for a presidential pardon so that he could be brought home for the peace process. In December of 2025, he petitioned that same Colombian tribunal to be recognized as a victim in a separate case tied to the extermination of a left-wing political party in Colombia decades earlier, a case examining thousands of deaths across the 1980s and 90s. So the paperwork moves, and the diplomatic notes travel back and forth between two capitals. None of it has moved the American sentence by a single day. He is still, for now, exactly where those measures placed him, in a cell in Colorado with a release date more than a quarter of a century away. Trinidad was contained because a guerrilla army's leverage stopped at a prison gate. The man who came next was held for a different reason, one written into American law decades before his crime was ever committed. And it began with a false name at a New York airport. Dandeni Muñoz Mosquera. Drug enforcement agents in the United States described him as the most prolific assassin the Medellin cartel ever produced, a man they linked to more than 200 deaths before he was even 26 years old. And yet, when American authorities finally put handcuffs on him, the charge had nothing to do with any of that. He was arrested for carrying a fraudulent passport at an airport in Queens. That single, almost minor arrest would eventually tie him to one of the deadliest acts of air terror the hemisphere had ever seen. He was born in August of 1965 in Medellin, the son of a police officer and an evangelist mother. He was pulled into the cartel around the age of 12, brought in through an older brother, and given the nickname La Kika. Within Pablo Escobar's organization, he became a chief enforcer and bodyguard, and American investigators later said he even ran a training camp that turned teenagers into hired guns. By his 20s, authorities on 2 continents connected him to more than 200 deaths, including dozens of Medellin police officers. The event that defined his infamy came on the 27th of November, 1989. Avianca Flight 203 lifted off, and a bomb aboard brought it down, taking the lives of all 107 people on the plane and 3 more on the ground, a total of 110, among them 2 American citizens. Prosecutors said the bombing was ordered by Escobar in an attempt to reach a presidential candidate believed to be aboard. This connection, though, is genuinely contested. Prosecutors placed La Kika at the center of the plot, yet Colombia's own attorney general at the time reportedly said there was no direct evidence tying him to the bombing. And a later review by the United States Justice Department's Inspector General examined claims that a Bureau explosives expert's testimony in the case had been flawed. What is not disputed is that the deaths occurred and that 2 of the victims were American. That bombing did not stand alone in the record around him. Weeks later, in December of 1989, a truck bomb devastated the headquarters of Colombia's security agency in Bogotá, an attack that took dozens of lives, and La Kika's name surfaced again among those the cartel used for its deadliest work. To American and Colombian investigators, he was not simply a triggerman. He was the instrument the cartel reached for when it wanted to send a message that a nation could not ignore, and by the time he left Colombia, the count of deaths connected to him had climbed into the hundreds. That American connection to the airliner is what sealed his fate. He was arrested on the 25th of September, 1991, in Queens, New York, traveling under a false passport. And at first, he was convicted only on the passport and false statement charges. How do you hold a man accountable for 110 deaths in another country's skies? The answer the United States reached for was jurisdiction. Because two of the victims aboard that flight were Americans, federal prosecutors could charge him at home, and they built a sweeping case. Racketeering, cocaine importation, running a continuing criminal enterprise, the bombing of the airliner, and the deaths of two United States citizens abroad. His first trial ended in a mistrial. The second convicted him on every count. On the 5th of May, 1995, a federal judge in Brooklyn handed him 10 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 45 years, telling him plainly that he was an evil man who had taken pleasure in what he did. It was the first conviction ever secured under a 1956 American law that made the bombing of a civilian airliner a federal crime, a statute that had sat on the books for nearly 40 years before a case arrived that fit it. There would be no parole and no early release. 10 life terms, stacked one after another, is a sentence designed to close every door at once. For years, tabloids placed him permanently inside the Supermax at Florence, and he was in fact one of that prison's earliest inmates. But that detail has since gone stale. As of early 2026, after a transfer through a penitentiary in Virginia, he is held at a federal facility in Atwater, California, still serving a sentence with no end date. The reversal in his circumstances was total. This was a man an entire cartel relied upon to carry out its most extreme acts, a figure hunted across 2 continents, and once the American system closed around him, that reach counted for nothing. The Medellin cartel had the reach to send its violence across borders. It had no reach at all inside a federal prison in the country whose citizens he had been convicted of harming. He was caught in a legal net cast decades earlier. The next man believed something simpler would keep him safe, that a wide enough stretch of open ocean was a wall no government could climb. Francisco Javier Arellano Felix. He inherited a cartel the way other men inherit a family firm. One brother lost his life in a shootout with police. Another was arrested. And almost overnight, the youngest of them was left running one of the most violent trafficking empires on the border between Mexico and the United States. He seemed to believe the open sea would keep him beyond anyone's reach, but a sport fishing trip off the coast of Baja California would deliver him straight into the hands of the United States Coast Guard. Born in December of 1969, he was one of 7 brothers who together built and ran the Arellano Felix organization, the trafficking network better known as the Tijuana Cartel. For years, he stood in the shadow of his siblings. That changed in 2002, when his brother Ramon, the family's feared enforcer, lost his life in a police shootout, and his brother Benjamin, the organization's mastermind, was arrested. With the 2 dominant figures gone, leadership fell to Francisco Javier, the brother they called El Tigrillo, the little tiger. Under him, the organization kept moving hundreds of tons of cocaine and marijuana into the United States, laundering the proceeds and ordering violence to protect its corridor through Tijuana. The Arellano Felix organization had spent years turning the border city into one of the most important smuggling gateways in the hemisphere, corrupting police, soldiers, and officials to keep the product flowing north. He became valuable enough that the American government placed a $5 million bounty on him. And for a time, he ran the operation the way his family always had, confident that the reach of the cartel and the corruption it bought would insulate him from anything that came for him. His confidence ended on the water, far from the corridor his family controlled. On the 16th of August, 2006, the United States Coast Guard intercepted a sport fishing yacht named the Dock Holiday in international waters off the coast of Baja California. Aboard was El Tigrillo on what should have been a day of fishing. Because the vessel was stopped in international waters, American authorities were able to take him directly, without any need for extradition through Mexico, and bring him to San Diego to face trial. The cartel's influence over Mexican institutions, the thing that had protected the family for years, simply did not extend to a Coast Guard cutter in open sea. What happens to a kingpin once the empire behind him can no longer touch the room he is standing in? In his case, the empire's protection evaporated the moment the cutter pulled alongside. In September of 2007, he pleaded guilty to running a continuing criminal enterprise and to conspiracy to launder money, choosing the certainty of a plea over the risk of a trial. On the 5th of November that year, a federal judge in San Diego sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole, ordered him to forfeit $50 million along with the yacht that had carried him to his capture, and noted that the plea agreement had spared him from facing a possible death sentence. The prosecution had taken the ultimate penalty off the table, and in return it had secured a permanent hold on the last of the brothers who had run the Tijuana cartel at its height. For a man who had commanded that entire organization, it appeared, on that November day, to be the end of the line. Except the story did not stay where that sentence left it. Held completely beyond the cartel's ability to intimidate a witness or buy an official, El Tigrillo made a decision that reshaped his own future. In June of 2015, roughly 8 years into a term that was supposed to keep him locked away until he died, his sentence was reduced to 23.5 years in exchange for extensive cooperation. He became a formal cooperating witness, sitting down with American investigators and giving evidence against cartel figures and against corrupt officials on both sides of the border. The organization that had once corrupted an entire city's institutions now faced testimony from the very man who had inherited its throne. From inside a cell he could not leave, the leader of the Tijuana cartel handed prosecutors evidence against the people he had once worked beside. As of early 2026, that reduced sentence remains in effect, and the Bureau of Prisons and the United States Marshals closely guard both his location and his release date, as they do with cooperators whose testimony has made them targets. The man who had believed the open ocean would keep him beyond reach now lives under guard, his location protected by the same government that once hunted him. His story turned on a choice, the choice to cooperate rather than resist. The man who came next responded to the threat of capture in the opposite way, by ordering an aircraft full of soldiers to be brought down from the sky. Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez. On the first day of May in 2015, a Mexican military helicopter carrying 18 people was flying over the state of Jalisco when a weapon fired from the ground reached up and tore it out of the air. It was the first time in the entire history of Mexico's drug war that organized crime had brought down an aircraft. And the order to fire had come from a young man whose only goal that day was to avoid being taken into custody. He was born in February of 1990 in California, which made him a citizen of both the United States and Mexico. He was the son of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the founder of the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the group known as the CJNG, and one of the most wanted men in the world. His father is said to have introduced him to trafficking at around the age of 15. By his 20s, he had risen to become the cartel's second-in-command, known across Mexico as El Menchito, the Little Mencho. For roughly a decade, from 2007 onward, he helped direct an international operation that pushed methamphetamine and cocaine into the United States, an enterprise protected by firearms, explosives, and outright violence. He had already been arrested once in early 2014 and released. That taste of freedom shaped what he did the next time capture came close. On that day in May 2015, cornered by security forces closing in and determined not to be taken again, he ordered CJNG gunmen to fire on the approaching military helicopter. Using an Iranian-made rocket-propelled grenade and a .50 caliber weapon, they struck the aircraft as it carried 16 soldiers and 2 federal police officers. 9 people lost their lives, and the helicopter came down. It was, until that moment, something Mexico's long war with the cartels had never seen. An organized crime group with the firepower and the will to knock a military aircraft out of the sky. A single soldier survived the crash, gravely burned over roughly 70% of his body, and years later, from a witness stand in another country, he would describe what happened that day. The strike bought El Menchito only weeks. He was captured in June of 2015 in Jalisco, less than 2 months after the helicopter came down, and when security forces surrounded him, he reportedly brandished a rifle and a grenade launcher and demanded to be released. This time it did not work. He was held, and in February of 2020, he was extradited to the United States to stand trial in Washington, far from the state where his family's name still carried the weight of law. What sentence answers a man who was willing to down a military aircraft rather than face a courtroom? The American justice system took its time and built its case. After a trial that lasted 2 weeks, one in which the sole survivor of that helicopter strike testified against him, he was convicted in September of 2024 of drug trafficking conspiracy and of firearms and destructive device charges. The evidence that he had helped move enormous quantities of cocaine and methamphetamine into the country was laid out count by count. Then, on the 7th of March, 2025, a federal judge in Washington sentenced him to life in prison and ordered him to forfeit $6 billion. The Attorney General's office described him as a man who had helped build the CJNG into a brutal organization that flooded American streets with poison. The young man who had ordered an aircraft, brought down to avoid custody, was now sentenced to spend the rest of his life in an American prison. By the time of that sentencing, the organization his father had built had grown into one of the most sprawling criminal networks on Earth, active across dozens of countries and rivaling the Sinaloa cartel itself for control of the drugs pouring into the United States. The $6 billion forfeiture ordered against him ranked among the largest ever attached to an American drug prosecution, a figure meant to measure the sheer scale of what the cartel moved. As of early 2026, he is serving that life sentence in United States federal custody, held within the same federal system that has swallowed the men before him on this list. Consider the arc of it. He grew up a citizen of the country that would one day imprison him, was drawn into the trade by his own father, rose to command a cartel's operations, and was so unwilling to face a courtroom that he ordered soldiers pulled out of the sky. Every one of those moves was meant to keep him free and in control. Every one of them ultimately delivered him deeper into the hands of American prosecutors. The backdrop to his case has grown heavier still. His father, El Mencho, the man who first drew him into the cartel, reportedly lost his life during a raid by Mexican special forces in early 2026, according to Mexican reporting that was still being confirmed at the time. If those reports hold, then the empire the son had shot a helicopter out of the sky to protect has, in the span of just a few years, lost both of the men who ran it. One to a foreign prison and the other to a raid in the mountains. El Menchito met capture with a rocket. The man who came next never had to fire a shot to stay free, because for more than 40 years, no one could even find him. Ismael Zambada Garcia. For more than 4 decades, he was among the most wanted men in Mexico, and almost no one could even picture his face. He co-founded the Sinaloa Cartel, outlasted partners who became legends and prisoners, and in all that time, he never once saw the inside of a jail cell. Then, in the summer of 2024, a private plane touched down just across the Texas border, and the man who could not be caught stepped off it in handcuffs. He would insist he had been betrayed. He was born on the first day of January, 1948, in a small community in the municipality of Culiacan, in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. He began as a marijuana grower in 1969, with a 6th-grade education, and over the decades he built something that outlasted every flashier figure around him. Known as El Mayo, he co-founded the Sinaloa Cartel and, after the 2016 capture of his partner Joaquin Guzman, became its principal leader. Where others sought the spotlight, he was the strategist and the deal-maker, the man handling the day-to-day machinery of the organization, and he carried a $15 million American bounty for most of his adult life. The scale of what he later admitted is difficult to absorb. When he entered his plea, he acknowledged that the cartel had moved at least 1.5 million kilograms of cocaine into the United States between 1980 and 2024, along with heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl produced using chemicals purchased from suppliers in China. He accepted responsibility for 85 underlying crimes. He admitted paying bribes to Mexican officials so the cartel could operate freely. Prosecutors said he had ordered torture and a pattern of assassinations, and that he was responsible for the death of his own nephew in the spring of 2024. The end of his freedom came not through a raid or a shootout, but through an act of betrayal from within his own world. On the 25th of July, 2024, a small aircraft landed at an airport in Santa Teresa, New Mexico, just across the border from El Paso, Texas. El Mayo was arrested there, alongside one of the sons of his old partner, Joaquin Guzman. In the days that followed, several conflicting accounts circulated about how he had ended up on that runway. One version held that he surrendered after negotiations. Another suggested he had been tricked. But El Mayo himself insisted he had been violently ambushed, bound, and flown across the border against his will, and the younger man's own guilty plea the following year supported that account, admitting that he had lured and delivered El Mayo into American custody. The man who had survived 40 years of rivals, raids, and manhunts was brought down by someone from inside his own circle. After evading capture for 40 years, what finally holds a man like this in place? The answer was an American courtroom and an agreement that took the death penalty off the table. On the 25th of August, 2025, he pleaded guilty in a federal court in Brooklyn to running a continuing criminal enterprise and to racketeering, after prosecutors agreed not to seek his execution. Then, on the 20th of July, 2026, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and ordered to forfeit $15 billion. A figure prosecutors conceded reflected no assets they had actually located or recovered. After a lifetime of slipping past every manhunt, he received a sentence with no end. That sentencing closed a pursuit that had outlasted 4 decades, a succession of American presidents, and a long line of Mexican administrations that had risen and fallen while he stayed free. He was the last of the Sinaloa Cartel's founding generation, still beyond the reach of a courtroom, and once the sentence was read, every man who had stood at the creation of that organization had either lost his life or been sealed inside an American prison. As of the summer of 2026, he had been held through his sentencing at a federal detention center in Brooklyn. Because of his age and his health, he requested to serve his sentence in a prison hospital, and his lawyer fought to keep him out of the Supermax at Florence, so his exact long-term facility has not been publicly confirmed beyond federal custody. What is certain is that his capture triggered a war inside the cartel. The moment he was gone, the organization split into rival factions, his loyalists on one side and the sons of his former partner on the other. And by the autumn of 2024, those two sides were fighting each other across Sinaloa. 5 men so far, 5 empires that could reach across borders to buy officials, silence witnesses, and take lives. And yet not one of them could reach past the walls of an American prison to pull their own leader out. The remaining names on this list only sharpen that pattern. One of them never ran a cartel at all. He was the government official paid to protect one, and he ended up held by the same system he had betrayed. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, Genaro Garcia Luna. For 6 years, he was the public face of Mexico's war on its own cartels. He stood beside the president, commanded the country's federal police, and promised, in front of cameras on both sides of the border, to dismantle the organizations bleeding the nation. American officials trusted him. They shared intelligence with him and helped fund the campaign he led. But according to federal prosecutors in the United States, the man leading the fight against the Sinaloa cartel was quietly being paid by it. He was born in the late 1960s and rose through Mexico's security services with a reputation as a modernizer, a technocrat who spoke the language of intelligence-led policing. He built and then led the country's federal investigative agency, modeling it on foreign law enforcement bureaus. And from 2006 to 2012, under President Felipe Calderón, he served as Secretary of Public Security, the most senior law enforcement official in the country. He was the architect of the American-backed offensive against the cartels, the man Washington worked with as it poured resources into Mexico's war. He would also become the highest-ranking Mexican official ever convicted in a United States courtroom. The case against him described a double life. In public, he directed the war, appearing at press conferences and coordinating with American agencies. In private, prosecutors said, he accepted millions of dollars in bribes from the Sinaloa cartel in exchange for protection, clearing the way for the organization to move more than 1 million kilograms of cocaine into the United States. Witnesses testified that money changed hands in briefcases and that the cartel considered him theirs. The prosecutors who tried him argued that the badge and the public promises had been a cover, and that the same official shaking hands with American agencies was quietly making sure their targets stayed in business. By the time the case caught up with him, he had left office, left Mexico, and built a comfortable new life as a private security consultant north of the border. In December of 2019, federal agents arrested him in Dallas, Texas, and the news landed like a shock in 2 countries at once. In Mexico, it seemed to confirm the darkest suspicions about the men who had led the drug war. In the United States, it raised uncomfortable questions about an ally Washington had trusted and funded for years. The road from that arrest to a verdict would take more than 3 years, and it would put a former cabinet minister in the same defendant's chair that had held the cartel bosses he was once tasked with hunting. How do you convict a man whose entire career was built on appearing to fight the very crime he was committing? The answer took a 4-week trial and a federal jury in Brooklyn. Over the course of it, cooperating witnesses from inside the cartel walked jurors through a system of payments that they said had run for years. On the 21st of February, 2023, He was convicted of running a continuing criminal enterprise, of conspiracies to distribute and import cocaine, and of making false statements to American authorities. Then, on the 16th of October, 2024, he was brought before the same Brooklyn judge who had already sentenced El Chapo himself years earlier, and who would go on to sentence El Mayo Zambada after him. Three of the biggest names in the story of the Sinaloa cartel passing through a single courtroom. Prosecutors had asked for life. Instead, the judge imposed a term of 460 months, roughly 38 years, along with a $2 million fine, and told him that beneath the pleasant manner and the polished speech, he carried the same kind of thuggishness as El Chapo, only expressed in a different form. For a man who had once commanded the nation's police, it was a staggering fall. He has not accepted it quietly. The trial judge denied his motion for a new trial, noting allegations that Garcia Luna had tried to bribe fellow inmates into making false statements on his behalf. In December of 2024, his lawyers filed an appeal with a federal appeals court, arguing that evidence had been withheld and that witnesses had lied. And in 2025, they asked for the chance to argue the case aloud before the judges. He also faces a separate civil action in Florida, brought by Mexico's Financial Intelligence Unit, seeking to seize assets it says were bought with cartel money. As of early 2026, he remains in federal custody, held through his sentencing at a detention center in Brooklyn, and serving a term that, barring a successful appeal, will keep him imprisoned into his 90s. The official who was paid to protect a cartel is now held by the same American system he once claimed to serve as a partner. His conviction carried a weight that reached far beyond a single courtroom. For decades, the suspicion that senior Mexican officials worked hand in hand with the cartels had circulated through the country without ever quite reaching the top. Here was that suspicion tested before a jury and proven, the man who had run the war against the cartels, shown to have been on the payroll of the enemy he was paid to fight. For the people of Mexico, and for the American agencies that had once treated him as a trusted ally, the verdict forced an uncomfortable reckoning with just how deeply the corruption had run. Garcia Luna sold out his own country from inside its government. The man who comes next sold out the criminal empire his own family had built. Joaquin Guzman Lopez. He is one of the sons of the most famous drug lord who ever lived, a leader of the faction that carried his father's name into a new generation of the Sinaloa cartel. And yet the act that will define him is not a shipment or an order to take a life. It is the day he personally delivered one of the most senior figures in the cartel into the hands of American agents, a betrayal that would set off a war across an entire Mexican state. He is one of the group known as the Chapitos, the sons of Joaquin Guzman, the man the world came to know as El Chapo. After their father was captured, imprisoned, and eventually sent to the United States, the sons stepped into the vacuum he left behind, dividing his empire among themselves and pushing the cartel deeper into the synthetic drug trade. Joaquin Guzman Lopez became a leader of one of the cartel's dominant factions. In court, he admitted to helping oversee the production and smuggling of an enormous range of drugs into the United States: cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, marijuana, and the fentanyl that had turned the Chapitos into some of the most hunted men on the continent. By the time of his arrest, the Chapitos had become the face of the cartel's most lucrative and most lethal business, and the top priority of American law enforcement. Two of his brothers remained fugitives, each carrying a reward of $10 million for information leading to their capture, while he and one other brother had been drawn into the American legal system. The faction had built much of its fortune on fentanyl, a synthetic drug cheap to produce and catastrophic in its reach, and that very success had painted a target on every leader who bore the family name. But his place on this list comes from a single decision. On the 25th of July, 2024, he boarded a small plane with the veteran co-founder of the cartel, El Mayo Zambada, and flew it across the border to an airport in New Mexico, where American agents were waiting. He would later admit in court that he had led the effort to seize El Mayo and deliver him, gambling that handing over such a prize would earn him leniency for himself. The man who had spent 40 years evading capture was walked into custody by the son of his own longtime partner. The fallout was immediate and bloody. Within weeks, the cartel fractured into two warring camps, El Mayo's loyalists on one side and the Chapitos on the other. And Sinaloa descended into the internal war that this account has already traced from the other man's side. What does a court do with a man who commits a crime in the very act of turning in a bigger one? The legal answer offered him far less than he had hoped. On the 1st of December, 2025, he pleaded guilty in a federal court in Chicago to one count of drug conspiracy and one count of running a continuing criminal enterprise, charges that carry a mandatory minimum of 10 years and a maximum of life. The judge did not set a date for his sentencing, leaving his future deliberately open. He had been held in custody since the summer of his arrest, and a prosecutor made a point of stating plainly that the seizure of El Mayo had never been sanctioned by the United States, and that Guzman Lopez would receive no credit for it. The act that had reshaped an entire cartel bought him nothing in the eyes of the court. As of early 2026, he remains in American custody in the Chicago area, awaiting a sentence that could still stretch to the rest of his life. The son who handed a legend to the government now waits, behind the same kind of walls, to learn how long he will stay behind them. His gamble had a certain logic to it. His younger brother had already shown that cooperation with the Americans could soften a sentence, and delivering the cartel's aging strategist was a far larger offering than anything the family had made before. The calculation ran into a hard line the prosecutors had drawn. There is a difference in the eyes of the American system between a defendant who assists the government on its terms and one who seizes another man on his own initiative, and the capture of El Mayo landed on the wrong side of that line. He had reshaped the balance of power in the underworld with a single act, and it had done nothing to shorten the years now waiting for him. There is a bitter irony in his position. He delivered another man into prison and now sits in one himself, still waiting to learn his own sentence. The next name belongs to his own brother, and it is the single case in this account where a cartel truly did force a captured leader back into the open. Ovidio Guzman Lopez. Every other name in this story shares one thing in common. The walls held. This one is the exception, because on a single chaotic afternoon in the Mexican city of Culiacan, a cartel did the one thing this entire story says could not be done. It forced a government to hand a captured leader back. He is another of El Chapo's sons, known by the nickname El Raton, the Mouse, and a leader of the same Chapitos faction. Within the cartel, he was closely tied to its fentanyl operation, the manufacturing and trafficking of the synthetic opioid that has devastated communities across the United States. When American prosecutors later laid out their indictment, they described production on an industrial scale and the extreme brutality the organization used to protect it, the kind of enterprise that made the Chapitos among the most hunted men in the hemisphere. The moment that sets his case apart came on the 17th of October, 2019. Mexican forces captured him during an operation in Culiacan, the heart of Sinaloa cartel territory, and the organization's response was immediate and overwhelming. As many as 700 gunmen flooded the city. They set up burning blockades across the roads, opened fire with heavy weapons including .50 caliber guns, seized control of entire districts, and brought Culiacan to the edge of collapse in a matter of hours. Faced with the prospect of a massacre in a major city, the Mexican government, on the direct order of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, made the extraordinary decision to release him rather than see the streets run with blood. 9 members of the security forces lost their lives in the chaos of that day. It became known across Mexico as the Culiacanazo, or Black Thursday, and it stands as the one time in this entire account that a cartel forced a prisoner's freedom by sheer force of arms. But that release had come from the Mexican government, extracted by holding an entire city hostage, and it did not hold for long. On the 5th of January, 2023, Mexican forces captured him a second time in another violent operation around Culiacan, one that again brought gun battles to the region. This time, there would be no reversal. He was extradited to the United States in September of that year, placed inside a system that did not bend to the tactics that had once freed him. The gunmen and burning blockades that could paralyze a Mexican city had no equivalent inside a federal courthouse in Chicago, and no show of force could alter the terms of an American plea. If a cartel could seize a whole city to free him once, what happens when the same man is placed inside the American system instead? What happened was a plea. On the 11th of July, 2025, he pleaded guilty in a federal court in Chicago to 4 counts spanning drug conspiracy and continuing criminal enterprise, part of a deal that resolved charges across more than one federal district. He became the first relative of El Chapo to strike a plea agreement with American prosecutors, and he agreed to cooperate fully with them. Even with that cooperation on the table, the arrangement carried a minimum of 20 years, and his sentencing was pushed back so that his cooperation could continue, with a status hearing set for early in 2026. For American prosecutors, a cooperating insider at the very top of the fentanyl trade was worth a great deal, because the drug his faction moved had become tied to tens of thousands of deaths across the United States each year, and a witness who understood the operation from the inside was rare. And here the story takes its strangest turn, one that must be stated plainly. As of early 2026, Ovidio Guzman Lopez is not in a Supermax prison. He is not at this moment in a prison at all. His federal record showed him released from the custody of the Bureau of Prisons in the summer of 2024, and he is reported to be held under protective arrangements at an undisclosed location while he cooperates with American authorities. The details of where he is and under what conditions have not been confirmed by the government, which has said little about a cooperator whose value depends on secrecy. What is known is enough to set his case apart from every other name here. The one man a cartel ever truly broke free now walks outside prison walls, not as a liberated kingpin, but as a protected witness working with the very government his family spent decades fighting. His case is the lone exception in this account, and it points back to a single fact. The only forced release here came from the Mexican government, wrung out by holding a whole city hostage. Once the American system had him, that leverage counted for nothing. From the son whose freedom was seized by an army in the streets, the story turns back to an older generation, to a mastermind who once sat on the American government's most wanted list, and whose younger brother has already appeared in this very account. Benjamin Arellano Felix. Earlier in this story, a younger brother inherited a cartel after his siblings fell. This is the brother whose capture set that inheritance in motion. He was the mastermind who built the Tijuana cartel from its earliest days, the man who earned a place on the American government's 10 most wanted list, and who still, in the end, walked out of a courtroom with a sentence lighter than the ones handed to some of the men who had worked beneath him. Known as El Mean, he had led the Arellano Felix organization since the mid-1980s, turning the border city of Tijuana into one of the busiest smuggling corridors in the hemisphere and a gateway for cocaine flowing toward the United States. His brothers filled the roles around him in what was, in effect, a family business built on fear. Ramon served as the feared enforcer until he lost his life in a shootout with police in 2002. Francisco Javier, the little tiger who appeared earlier in this account, would inherit what remained. A fourth brother, known as the Doctor, rounded out the leadership of what was, in effect, a family dynasty. Under Benjamin's direction, the organization corrupted police, soldiers, and politicians across the region, and it built a reputation for making witnesses and informants disappear so completely that investigators were left with nothing to follow. In court, he admitted to being the shot caller, the man who had directed the importation of hundreds of tons of cocaine and marijuana into the United States between the mid-1980s and 2002, a trade that generated hundreds of millions of dollars. He acknowledged the bribery and the orders that had cost lives. For years, he had been one of the most wanted men in North America, a fixture on the American government's 10 most wanted list, protected by the reach of the organization he had created. His run ended on the 9th of March, 2002, when he was arrested in the Mexican city of Puebla. The Arellano Felix organization had risen through the late 1980s and the 1990s to dominate the lucrative Tijuana crossing, and for more than a decade, it stood among the largest and most feared cartels in all of Mexico. Benjamin's capture, coming in the same year that his enforcer brother lost his life, marked the beginning of the organization's slow collapse. He served years inside a Mexican prison under a sentence of his own there before he was extradited to the United States in April of 2011 to answer for the empire he had built. How does the founder of a cartel end up with a lighter sentence than his own lieutenants? The answer was a plea agreement. In January of 2012, he pleaded guilty in San Diego to racketeering and to conspiracy to launder money. On the 2nd of April that year, the same federal judge who would go on to sentence his brother, the little tiger, handed Benjamin 25 years in prison and ordered him to forfeit $100 million. Prosecutors had agreed to dismiss charges that could have brought him a term of 140 years. At the sentencing, he tried to walk the agreement back, insisting that he was being blamed for things other men had done, and the judge told him bluntly that he deserved a life sentence. The bargain held anyway. It was a striking outcome, because one of his own lieutenants had already received 40 years, a longer term than the boss he had once served under. As of early 2026, Benjamin Arellano Felix is held at a federal penitentiary in Virginia, with a release date recorded for the spring of 2033. In April of 2024, at the age of 68, he filed a handwritten request for compassionate release, arguing that his was a nonviolent drug offense. When his American term ends, he is not simply to be freed. He is scheduled to be deported to Mexico to serve out the remainder of the sentence still waiting for him there. That leaves an unusual thread still hanging over his case. Even if he is released in 2033, that release would only carry him back across the border into another cell to finish out what remains of his Mexican sentence. And there is a larger symmetry in it as well. The story of the Tijuana cartel has now run through two of these brothers. The little tiger who cooperated his way to a reduced term and the mastermind who bargained his way to 25 years, both of them held, in the end, by the same country their organization had spent decades flooding with narcotics. The Arellano Felix brothers ran their empire from the western edge of Mexico. The final name on this list rose on the opposite side of the country, on the eastern border. He came to the cartel world from an unlikely place, from inside a police force. Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sanchez. In 1999, a group of armed men surrounded two American federal agents on a street in the Mexican border city of Matamoros and held them at gunpoint, daring them to reach for their weapons. The man giving the orders was a former police officer who would go on to run one of the oldest cartels in Mexico. It would take the American government more than 2 decades to make him answer for that day. He was born in Matamoros in January of 1971, and before he ever entered the criminal world, he wore the uniform of the city's municipal police. The Gulf Cartel he would come to lead was one of the oldest criminal organizations in Mexico, and it controlled some of the most valuable smuggling routes on the entire eastern border. Its roots reached back generations to Prohibition-era smugglers who had run liquor across that same stretch of border long before cocaine ever crossed it. By the time Costilla Sanchez took command, it stood as one of the oldest continuous criminal enterprises anywhere in the Americas, an organization that had outlasted the rise and fall of nearly every rival around it, and had learned, over decades, how to root itself in the life of the region it controlled. He left the police for that organization, and when its boss, Osiel Cardenas Guillen, was arrested in 2003, Costilla Sanchez rose to lead it. His predecessor's fate was itself a warning of what lay ahead, because Osiel Cardenas would later be extradited to the United States and imprisoned there, the same road that now stretched in front of the man who had replaced him. Known as El Cos, he commanded the cartel for nearly a decade. He oversaw its security operations, including the armed wing the cartel had recruited from former Special Forces soldiers, a group that would become infamous in its own right, Los Zetas. That armed wing eventually grew strong enough to break away, and a dispute over his refusal to hand over a wanted man helped ignite the war between the Gulf Cartel and the Zetas in 2010. That conflict tore through the northeastern states of Mexico, through Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and Coahuila, and it cost an enormous number of lives, leaving whole towns caught in its crossfire. Under his command, the cartel moved staggering quantities of narcotics north, more than 10,000 kilograms of cocaine and more than 140,000 kilograms of marijuana into the United States, all of it backed by violence and intimidation. And running beneath it all was that day in 1999, the armed confrontation with agents of the American Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Drug Enforcement Administration, the standoff on a Matamoros street that would form the basis of his first American indictment and would wait, unanswered, for more than 20 years. That single confrontation captured everything American authorities came to hold against him. Where most of his charges involved drugs moving through ports and across borders, this one involved weapons leveled directly at United States agents on foreign soil, an act of open defiance toward the country that would eventually hold him. And the armed wing he had overseen, Los Zetas, went on to become a byword for cruelty across Mexico after it broke from the Gulf Cartel, spreading a level of violence that reshaped the country's underworld. The man who had helped build and command that security apparatus had set loose forces that outgrew even him. His time at the top ended on the 12th of September, 2012, when Mexican Marines captured him in the state of Tamaulipas, the same border region he had ruled for years. The war he had helped set in motion became one of the bloodiest chapters in Mexico's recent history, as the Gulf Cartel and its former enforcers fought town by town for control of the Northeast, and his capture took one of the last of the old guard Gulf Cartel bosses off the board. 3 years later, on the 30th of September, 2015, he was extradited to the United States, flown north on the same day as another notorious trafficker, an American-born figure known as La Barbie. The two men delivered together into the hands of American courts to face the charges that had waited so long for them. What is the reckoning for a man who once held United States agents at gunpoint and ran a cartel that gave rise to one of the most violent groups in the hemisphere? The courts answered in full. On the 26th of September, 2017, he pleaded guilty to drug trafficking conspiracy and to 2 counts of assaulting and threatening federal agents, the charges reaching all the way back to that confrontation in Matamoros 18 years earlier. On the 15th of September, 2022, a federal judge in Brownsville, Texas, sentenced him to life in prison and ordered him to forfeit $5 million. The former police officer who had once pointed guns at American agents on a Mexican street would now spend the rest of his life inside an American prison, held by the government those agents served. As of early 2026, he remains in federal custody, serving that life sentence with no possibility of release. The cartel he once led still fights over the territory he controlled. The man who commanded it, the former officer who once raised weapons against the agents of the country that now holds him, will not see the outside of a prison again. 10 men, 10 empires that could buy governments and command armies, and in the end, the same set of walls held nearly every one of them. The system that caught them is still working through the names that come after. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.